This exceptional panel of witnesses that we have before the subcommittee, and to thank you all for joining us today for what I believe is going to be an incredibly important hearing. Hopefully our members will be streaming in, because I think this is going to be a very important hearing to lay the foundation for what we are going to be doing for the rest of the next several months anyway. One of the things that we recognize is nearly 12 years ago, this subcommittee met to hold a hearing on readiness regarding the Army AH-64 helicopter fleet. The spring and summer of 1999, we were involved in combat operations with NATO allies in Kosovo, and you can see the helicopter up on the screen. Chairman Bateman and Ranking Member Ortiz held a hearing on the readiness of the Apache fleet because an internal Army memo had been leaked to the press. That memo was written by then Brigadier General Richard Cody, and it showed shortcomings, training failures, and readiness issues associated with the Apache fleet, and specifically related to the deployment of the 24 AH-64s as part of the Task Force Hawk. In the reviews that followed, the GAO found 146 lessons learned, which range from insufficient training to the need for additional capabilities such as night vision devices and improved command and control capabilities. However, interestingly, Congress had been told previously that the unit that was deployed was C-1, or fully combat mission capable. Today, we are here to talk about the readiness of the force, not just the readiness of today's force, but the force we will need to deal with global challenges in the next decade and beyond. If you flip from the Apache helicopter we talked about there and look to today's concern in the Pacific, something that I know is near and dear to the ranking member's heart, it's clear that we can't afford another Task Force Hawk situation where we're told we're ready and we wake up to have hearings after that where we find out that we were very insufficient in our preparations and our preparedness. We have a constitutional responsibility that none of us take lightly, but we must be informed if we are to successfully provide for the defense of this nation. We learn all too often about critical shortfalls, not from the military, not from the DoD, but from leaked press reports, whistleblowers, and generals after they have retired. Today, we have a wonderful panel of witnesses to help us not only frame the challenges for the future, but to also help this subcommittee ask the right questions and to get the answers we need to make critical resourcing decisions in extraordinarily challenging times. Joining us today are some individuals who served on a panel, and I want to commend to everybody's reading, if you haven't, the Quadrennial Defense Review Independent Panel, the report that was published. This was an incredibly bipartisan effort. I want to commend all of you for your work on creating, one, a consensus that I know is very difficult in today's world to reach, but secondly, the thorough analysis and the job that you have done. And commend to each of our committee members, if you haven't read this, I think it's good reading, and we've provided you with executive summaries that I think you'll find useful. Today we have joining us Mr. Rudy de Leon, the Senior Vice President for National Security and International Policy at the Center for American Progress, Mr. Thomas Donnelly, the Resident Fellow and Director of the Center for Defense Studies at the American Enterprise Institute for Public Policy Research, Ms. Mackenzie Eaglin, the Research Fellow for National Security Studies at the Heritage Foundation, and Dr. Thomas G. Mencken, Professor of Strategy at U.S. Naval War College. I just gave you what they are now. You each have in your memos their biographies, which I suggest you look at because they are very telling on the expertise that we bring to this panel today. I also wanted to suggest that this is one of the most bipartisan panels, I'm sorry, one of the most bipartisan subcommittees probably that we find in Congress. We hope to do some things this year that are out of the box. We want to get to answers, and we don't want to go through the formats. Historically, on our hearings, what we normally do is we bring in 3 generals and an admiral, and we spend the first few minutes telling them what a wonderful job they've done in serving the country. They next spend the next 10 minutes telling us what a great job we've done in supporting the men and women in uniform across the globe. Then everybody has a 5-minute window Our witnesses oftentimes feel like they're in depositions where their goal is just to get out without saying anything. And we ask our questions in staccato. We want to change that. It is my hope that we will have the support of the ranking member at some point in time, so that rather than be in those boxes, that we're bringing witnesses in here where we're not asking them for formal statements, we're not having just prepared statements, but we can really get at the answers that we need to make sure we've answered one crucial question: are we ready? And we have to make sure that we're doing that. I want our members to feel as free as possible. If you have follow-up questions, if you want to explore an issue, that we can do that so that you don't feel you're in that confines of normal structure. So with that, I'd like to now turn to my dear friend and colleague and somebody that I know that is very concerned about the readiness of this nation, especially in the Pacific, and that is Madeline Bordallo from Guam. Ms. Bordallo.
Mr. Chairman, thank you, and thank you for your leadership of this very important subcommittee. To all our witnesses, thank you for appearing before our subcommittee today. As the United States continues to be engaged in 2 wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, our military continues to experience significant readiness strains across the spectrum of capabilities. Further, larger fiscal matters in our Federal Government continue to squeeze the Department of Defense budget. Pentagon leadership is looking for places to find efficiencies, and historically, the operation and the maintenance budget is a favorite target given its size and availability. The QDR and the Global Defense Posture Report have outlined an ambitious yet realistic defense posture that will be needed over the coming years. So it is important that we find balance in equipping, training, and positioning our force to deal with emerging threats abroad, such as al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula or the extremist disturbances in Indonesia or the southern Philippines, which is right next door to Guam. However, as a nation, we must not lose focus of more traditional threats that face us, such as Iran's and North Korea's nuclear programs or China's non-transparent military buildup. Being a global power is not easy, nor can it be done cheaply. The QDR and the Global Defense Posture Review provided this Congress with a guideline for allocating resources over the coming years to deal with a multitude of threats. Every defense budget since the beginning of budgets has assumed a certain amount of risk. The Department has been cautious over the past few years in the amount of risk it has accepted, while trying to balance the needs of the ongoing wars with the other threats that exist to our country. At the outset of the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, I believe we took too much risk, and the consequence was an under-equipped and ill-trained force for the type of the wars that we are now conducting. Even as we depended upon them more and more to provide critical enabling capabilities, National Guard units across this country were left with paltry equipment levels. It took congressional action and oversight to provide them with the equipment they needed to train for the missions they would be performing in both Iraq and Afghanistan. I recognize that we are not always at 100% fill for equipment, but we've done our best to apply resources to address the levels of risk that exist in the budget. I think the key is providing enough flexibility so that as threats emerge, the military can adapt and respond quickly and posture itself to protect our interests. The military buildup on Guam is a perfect example of how defense and posture reviews can lead to net positive benefits for our strategic posture across the globe. Making our military capabilities on Guam more robust allows us to defend against North Korea aggression, as well as counter the secretive buildup of Chinese forces. The strategic location of forces on Guam sends a very clear signal to our allies in the Asia-Pacific region that we remain their partner and a power in the Asia region. Similarly, a buildup of forces on Guam also allows us to address threats that may arise in Indonesia or the southern Philippines, not to mention humanitarian assistance missions to our Pacific Island partners and other hotspots in the region. The military buildup on Guam is not without its challenges, but it is the right thing for our nation and the right thing for Guam. We just need to get it done right. And to that end, I do have some concerns about the reduction in operation and maintenance funding across all the services in fiscal year 2012 as compared to 2011 levels. We need to examine these funding levels through the lens of strategic documents like the QDR and the Global Defense Posture Report, and not lose sight of our emerging capability needs across the globe. I would be interested to learn more from our witnesses today on what they think can be done to strengthen the QDR and the Global Posture Review process. In some cases, these documents have been seen merely as budget drills. So what can Congress do to strengthen the process even further? I appreciate the work of the committee in creating a QDR review panel, but what other ideas should we consider in the future? Again, I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and look forward to the testimony from our witnesses.
Thank you, Ms. Bordallo. And now we're going to hear from our witnesses, and we're going to go in alphabetical order, if that's okay with the witnesses, and we're going to start with Mr. De Leon. And thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and members of the subcommittee. I appreciate this chance to come and testify before the House Armed Services Committee today. And certainly, as many know, I have a long-time relationship with the committee, but I was staff director of the committee so long ago that Mr. Reyes is probably the only member that remembers me from that tenure. But it was a remarkable time, tenure of President Reagan, and many other things. So I certainly welcome this opportunity to testify today. The four panelists, we're used to working with each other. We have, in a bipartisan way, we have different perspectives and will bring different views that I pledge will be interesting and I think informative to the committee. But I think what also, even where we disagree, we have a track record of finding the consensus, which I know is at the heart of what the Armed Services Committee does. I'd just like to take a few minutes. We each have formal written statements, if we can just submit them, and I'll just make a few opening comments because ultimately we want the engagement back and forth. One, I think we all acknowledge Secretary Gates has really appropriately focused the Department on the ongoing combat in Afghanistan and in Iraq. That was a key decision made. His tenure began in late 2006. We've seen the impact of his leadership in the combat AOR. But at the same time, when we look at these budgets are driven by ongoing combat. And when the QDR independent review looked at the budget, it was our job to sort of look beyond Iraq and Afghanistan to that period that will follow on. And so that was the bulk of our work. Also, the QDR tasking coming from the Congress was not to be constrained by budget issues, but to look at the big policy questions there. So very briefly, what I would like to just cover are four key points in my testimony. One, we all agree the Asia-Pacific is critical. That is the new avenue of global commerce, and so we need new emphasis and new resources for the Asia-Pacific. The transparency of China is a key issue, the PLA, and an element of our mill-to-mill dialogue. But Asia-Pacific is at the top of our list in terms of needing to focus strategically on that region, because the role of the United States in that region since the end of World War II has been absolutely critical. The rise of China, the balancing of historic tensions in Asia, the growth of their economies have all been made possible by the protection that the U.S. military, our diplomats, but particularly the men and women of our armed forces have given the region of Asia. It has been a unique period, and Asia, because of the American presence, has been divorced from many of the regional tensions which created conflict in the past. The second are what I'll call new security concerns. That's cyber. That is homeland security, whole of government reforms to assist our troops in the field with capabilities coming from other executive branch organizations, and then the importance of prolonged mill-to-mill relationships. The challenges in Egypt right now, The U.S.'s military ability to talk to the Egyptian military has proven to be just a crucial set of skills. When the Soviet Union disbanded, it was the mill-to-mill relationship with some of the emerging democracies of the former Warsaw Pact, Poland, the Czech Republic, Hungary, that allowed for a solid democratic transition of those militaries that are now very capable NATO members. And the Prime Minister of Poland, who is now one of the leading spokespersons for NATO, was here in town to be acknowledged by the Atlantic Council this week. But, this was a dramatic change from 1980 and the end of the Solidarity movement to the end of communism. But the mill-to-mill relationships are extremely important. The third issue that I've covered in detail in my opening statement is energy. Right now, we're 50% of our energy exports come from this hemisphere, from Canada and Mexico at the top. As we go further south, some of those suppliers become more problematic, Venezuela, but 50% of our energy imports come from the Western Hemisphere, and that's a good thing. Slightly less than 20% come from the Persian Gulf region, a higher percentage coming from Africa. But from a military perspective, the supply line of fuel is pivotal to the mobility of our forces. I know that there are initiatives that this committee created in the last several years to focus on the energy requirement. That's a key component of logistics. It's what makes the United States military unique. We are in a tense period in terms of the price of energy, but we still control our destiny. But figuring out our energy strategy, particularly for our troops that are deployed, is going to be a critical challenge for us. Last piece, the U.S. economy as a component of national security. Meeting the readiness challenges of the next 20 years is dependent upon our country, the Department of Defense, working with Congress to really get our economic house back in order. Now, during my tenure at Armed Services and then later my tenure at the Department of Defense, I lived continuously under balanced budget rules. The challenge to go from high deficits to a balanced budget really started in 1987 with the Graham-Rudman legislation that came from Senator Phil Graham, Senator Warren Rudman. It was followed by an agreement in 1980 between President George Bush, and negotiated largely with Congressman Gephardt here. But when you look at these in their conclusion, that 1990 agreement really started a foundation moving toward a balanced budget. We have the Clinton initiatives in 93 and then the negotiations in 95 and 96, which really lock us into a trajectory of a balanced budget that we realize in 1999. It was a lot of work to get there. The challenge was to keep military readiness high. The Armed Services Committee throughout that period of the 90s did a number of reports. Mr. Spence's report to Secretary Perry in the early 90s on readiness. I think Mr. Donnelly may have actually been one of the authors of that. Was an important piece of the debate and the discussion. But my key point is that we really do have to get our budgets and our economy in order, that throughout the late 80s, throughout the 90s, there were a series of very clear rules that applied government-wide that had a big impact in terms of focusing on spending. Just a last point on that, and I don't want to speak much longer here. Clearly, coming out of we've had very high defense budgets the last 10 years, but those budgets have been fundamentally different than the high defense budgets of the 1980s. The 1980s defense budgets were largely investment budgets, and the budgets of the last decade have really been budgets to support military forces in the field in combat, and so they have been high on consumables. So you've been consuming a lot of personnel dollars, you've been consuming a lot of readiness dollars. The procurement numbers are coming up, but coming out of this
period of significant defense spending, we need to acknowledge that these really have been budgets that have supported combat operations in the field and not the investment budgets of the 1980s. And then finally, moving forward on the American economic challenge, U.S. national security has long rested on the strength of our economy. If you go and read the NSC 68, which was the strategy early in the Truman presidency that really looked at the future, they had two big assumptions: an extremely capable military and a highly viable economy. And so the challenge, I think, in the readiness area, in addition to the line items of the budget, will be to move forward on the economic challenge of creating jobs, promoting competitiveness and innovation, while reducing the long-term budget deficits. That's a message that the rest of the world needs to know. This is a country that is capable of great things, that we're not in economic decline, and we need to send that message because American national security leadership has been premised on our strength of global leadership, economically as well as from the national security perspective. So, Mr. Chairman, we appreciate, I do, this opportunity to testify.
Thank you, Mr. DeLeon. And now Mr. Donnelly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to the ranking member. I would echo what Rudy said about what a pleasure it is to return to our former place of employment. One may leave the committee staff, but emotionally and mentally it's hard to escape. I'm also going to end up agreeing a lot with Rudy. I think one of the most disturbing elements of the QDR panel for Rudy was that he found himself too often in agreement with me. I've always known Rudy to be a closet neoconservative, or at least a Truman Democrat, but I think Rudy hadn't faced that reality yet. But to turn to serious matters, I was impressed by both the opening statements because they went, both the question of Task Force Hawk and the question of the invasion of Iraq go directly to the questions that I hope you guys will consider when you're considering readiness. The most important question, and where we've fallen short so frequently in the post-Cold War years, is when we ask the question, not are we ready by the metrics and the yardsticks that the Department produces, but are those yardsticks the right assessment of what our forces need to be able to do? The question is, what should we be ready for? And if we don't answer that question adequately, the other metrics are interesting, but not really the right ones that we should be using. Also, interestingly enough, the QDR panel found itself very much in a similar circumstances as we did our work. After we got the initial briefings on the QDR itself, there was widespread dissatisfaction among the members, a very distinguished panel, as Rudy said, bipartisan, even nonpartisan in its direction from Secretary Perry, about what the QDR process had produced. We recognized that we did not have the time nor the staff capability to replay the entire QDR process, so we were looking around for a set of measurements to understand what the requirements for U.S. forces were. And actually there was very spirited debate, but pretty quick agreement that U.S. security interests remain constant over time, that the issues, the capabilities, and the interests of the United States don't change. The adversaries and enemies and allies and friends may change. Technological circumstances may change. But certainly in the post-World War II period, there's a remarkable consistency about what United States purposes have been. And we felt that was a pretty reasonable set of measurements for us to use about what our forces should be prepared to do. And my prepared testimony goes through that in some detail. I'd also like to save, I have a good idea of what my colleagues are going to say, so I'd like to just cherry pick a few of the things, if I may, in my brief remarks here. We found four sort of enduring U.S. interests: the defense of our homeland, which includes, as Rudy suggested, our neighborhood. Think of the Monroe Doctrine, for example, but larger North America, if you will. The ability to freely access, both for commercial purposes and when necessary in wartime, what are lumped together as the international commons, though Secretary John Lehman loathed that word and excised it from the panel report. Basically, the freedom of the seas, the skies, of space, and now of cyberspace. That's where the life of the commercial trading system occurs, and those are the domains, if you will, that are essential not only for protection of the United States itself, but the means through which we project power abroad. If we can't deploy our forces by sea, by air, watch them and talk to them and provide them with intelligence and reconnaissance from space, or communicate with them through the use of the Internet, then our ability to do what we have to do around the world is going to be severely constrained. And it was very much the conclusion of the panel that those commons, which have been the distinct American way of war, are now contested commons. And the more modern, as you sort of go through the progression from maritime to cyberspace, the more you go through that batting order, the more contested the domains are. We've also always worried about the balance of power in the vital regions of the world. In Europe, where we spent a century, 2 world wars, an immense amount of blood and treasure to produce what looks to be a durable peace and has allowed us to draw down forces in recent years. And obviously in East Asia, as Rudy suggested and as others will comment. But also, and this is where I'd like to focus my remarks, on the greater Middle East. Particularly now that we see the region actually, the peoples of the region themselves taking up the cause of individual freedom and liberty that so many Americans have sacrificed, including sacrificed their lives for, over the past generation, not just in the past 10 years. The fact is, this has always been a volatile region. It's becoming more volatile now. Who knows how it's going to come out, but it will still be of critical interest to the United States and to the world. Rudy mentioned energy supplies. We're lucky in that a relatively small percentage of our oil actually physically comes from the Persian Gulf. But of course, oil is a fungible commodity. It's a global market. And our most reliable allies, particularly in East Asia, but also in Europe, depend on those energy supplies. And it's also critical to the developing economies of China and India. The entire world, and certainly the commercial world, the economic world, benefits from having a stable oil pipeline writ large, or energy pipeline, to which the Middle East contributes the largest amount, globally speaking, and which is critical for the world's economic progress and prosperity. We're obviously at a moment of fragile recovery ourselves here at home. We've seen gas prices spike in the last couple of weeks. We can only imagine what an extended rise in gas prices and in energy prices would do. The notion that Iraq and Afghanistan are the final chapters of America's involvement in the region seem unbelievable to me. There were many chapters before 9/11. We put up with Saddam Hussein for 15 years, and he made our lives miserable long before the invasion of Iraq in 2003. The same is true of Iran, which, as Rudy suggested, is on the verge, who can say exactly when, of acquiring a nuclear capability that would plunge the Gulf into even greater turmoil. And we see in places like Egypt, where luckily we have contacts, levers to ensure that the transition that comes is something that we can shape. But that's almost an exception that proves the rule. There's very little that we could do in Libya that wouldn't involve, again, a use of military force. And again, whether that's wise or the right thing to do is not my point. The question is, we can see that it's already a question for our President. So, again, as we look forward and try to say, what should we be ready for? The idea that we're not going to be somehow, someplace, in some way involved in the Middle East seems to me to be just a faulty planning assumption. And the one thing that we've seen since 9/11 is that we have not had that traditional two-war capacity to do many things at the same time. We had to essentially get to a point of culmination in Iraq before we could again focus adequate resources in Afghanistan. And let's hope those turn out to be durable successes in both cases. But to go back to Rudy's tenure in the Pentagon and before, it's an expression of the win, hold, win force sizing strategy. Just to go back and to conclude by referring to your opening remarks, Mr. Chairman, Task Force Hawk is a perfect example of what I'm trying to get at. Those Apaches were probably perfectly ready to destroy the Soviet tanks in the second echelon that they'd spent their entire lives in Germany preparing to do. But when they were asked to pick up and deploy in support of the Kosovo War or in support of Bosnia, they didn't have the logistics or the transportation or all the other support structures that they needed to survive in the muck and mire or to get there. Likewise, the invasion of Iraq in 2003 was as classic an example of mobile armor warfare as we will see in our lifetimes. 3 weeks from crossing the line of departure to knocking down the Saddam statues in Baghdad is a remarkable accomplishment, probably moving faster than George Patton ever moved across France. But that wasn't the end of the story because it wasn't obviously the end of the war. So the problem when assessing readiness, really in a strategic sense, is much less are we meeting the benchmarks, the formal, narrowly defined benchmarks that are currently being employed. But have we captured in our assessments and in our readiness metrics those things that really, truly reflect the tasks that we are almost certain to ask our forces to do, that flow directly from this assessment of our interests and add up in sum to a global set of challenges. And we've learned, again, much to our sorrow and pain, that what happens in the Middle East, although strategically connected to what happens in East Asia, may require an entirely different kind of force and will have to be things that the U.S. militarily does simultaneously rather than sequentially. So as you guys look at the question of the readiness of our forces, I urge you to take that one step back and ask, are the benchmarks themselves the right ones? Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Donovan. Ms. Eglin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to the ranking member for your unconventional approach to your first hearing of the year. I think it's just an outstanding way to take a step back, look at the big picture outside of the defense witness hearing in a box, and really talk about things to think about for the future. I want to again thank Rudy for his leadership last summer on the QDR independent panel as our esteemed chairman on the Force Structure and Personnel Subcommittee, where we gained a lot of knowledge and experience into helping you answer these questions. I think Task Force Hawk is a powerful way to open this hearing because the findings, the two primary findings from GAO, which is insufficient training and the need for additional capabilities, is exactly where we are in almost every sort of major area across the services today. And I'm very concerned, like you, that the likelihood of this happening again is high, and it's getting higher. So Rudy and Tom very sufficiently laid out a snapshot of the world as it is, and I want to provide an overview of the state of our hard power capabilities, in particular our military, to carry out a lot of the things that might be asked of them. I was told by a senior Special Forces official recently that if you look at a view of the world from space and America assesses the 50 most important nation states on the planet Earth in relative to the war on terror, whatever term you want to use therein, they all have their lights out for the most part. and we're talking countries very much like Afghanistan, which has very little infrastructure to begin with, but it goes much further beyond Iraq and Afghanistan, and it's something that, again, as Tom just said, our efforts and interests around the world are not going to go away as we wind down in Iraq and we hopefully eventually wind down in Afghanistan. What have we been seeing across the force lately? As most of you know, we have a pretty old and geriatric and rusting force structure on the equipment side, and we have a grand experiment occurring on the personnel side, employing an all-volunteer force for over 10 years in continuous operations, which has never been done since we stood it up in the early 70s. On the equipment side, not accounting for new systems like, for example, some helicopter rotary wing platforms and some drones in particular, and leaving out some ISR and comms capabilities. Just looking at the major systems that we use to facilitate operations everywhere else around the world, our Air Force, Navy, and Marine Corps tactical aircraft are averaging 50 to 25 years old, depending on which service we're talking about. The Army's armored personnel carriers are almost 30 years old. Bradley fighting vehicles are approaching 20 years old. Our cargo helicopters that we use heavily in Afghanistan are almost 20 years old. Some have been upgraded, of course. Our Hueys are 35. Our cruisers are 20 years old. Our Orion long-range aircraft that we use for ISR capabilities are 25 years old. Our bombers, our newest ones are 20, but our oldest ones are almost 50 years old. I actually heard a story just yesterday that some of the bomber pilots in the Dakotas, actually their grandfather literally flew the same plane. Our transport aircraft, our wide-body cargo aircraft are over 40 years old, and as you well know, the tankers are almost 50 years old. What we're seeing across the services is the cross-leveling of not just equipment, which is also known as the cannibalization, but of people as well, to reorient for various missions and needs and to really scramble to match requirements in Iraq and Afghanistan. And this has a direct impact on the reserve component and on the National Guard and reserves in each of your states and districts. As the ranking member noted in her opening statement, over the past 5 years, on average, most states in the country have had less than 40% of their Guard equipment on hand available to respond to everything else that the military does, including hurricanes, floods, wildfires, and more. And there's a direct effect on the health of the active force and, of course, the reserve component. When you're cross-leveling people and equipment, everything from, weapon systems like machine guns and handguns to vehicles, tracked and wheeled, to helicopters, what that basically means is everything is upended in the readiness cycle as a result of this. And then you're having the units that are about to deploy, they're not able to actually train on their actual weapon systems in live fire exercises as often as they need to be. In the last 4 years, we've seen less than half of all Air Force units that were fully mission capable. The Navy, a couple of years ago, discovered that 2 surface combatant ships were unfit for combat and had to hold what they called a strategic pause, where we basically halted the entire worldwide fleet of all of our surface combatants to assess their readiness levels in the case that they were going to prove unready in a very embarrassing incident. We're also seeing the effects on training. Obviously our forces have been very heavily emphasizing counterinsurgency capabilities, and it's coming at the expense of most others as well, including combined arms and jungle warfare and amphibious capabilities and operations as well. The former Chief of Staff of the Air Force actually used the term ancillary training creep, and I think that's actually effective for services like the Navy and the Air Force in particular that have to do things beyond supporting counterinsurgency operations. Their ability to prepare for other conflicts has been significantly degraded. Quickly, I will just close out by talking, using the Special Forces, again, going back to them as a snapshot. I referenced the Air Force in my testimony as a case study in readiness and how unready we actually really are for, again, things much beyond Afghanistan, including, for example, a no-fly zone over Libya, which would be greatly challenge the military to undertake. Currently, we have more than 80% of our Special Forces deployed in one region in Central Command. And they have been deployed at unsustainable rates since 2001. And what that means is it's coming at the expense of their their jobs, for example, in Latin America and elsewhere around the world. Post 9/11, our Special Operations Forces are twice the size. They have 3 times the budget that they had before 9/11, but they have more than quadruple the demand that was on them previously. Take, for example, the 7th Special Forces Group in Latin America, where they're supposed to be working right now. They've been carrying almost half the load in Afghanistan for 7 years. So we were leaving behind all of these other areas of the world which are not becoming any more safe, and the areas of risks and challenges are not growing any less steep over time. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Eglin. Dr. Mankin.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, members of this committee. Thank you for inviting me here to testify this morning. Mr. Chairman, in line with your intent, I'd like to keep my opening remarks brief and to submit my written statement to the record. In the brief time I have, I'd like to cover 4 topics. Just a few words about maybe how we should think about readiness from a strategic perspective. Then to zoom in and focus on one particular contingency, the need to deal with China's military modernization and development of anti-access capabilities. Third, to talk about our readiness to counter China's anti-access capabilities, and then hopefully to end on somewhat of a note of opportunity for us. So on readiness, as someone who's spent a career studying, teaching, and practicing strategy, I'm certainly sympathetic to those who face the challenging task of trying to ensure that U.S. armed forces are ready to face the full spectrum of challenges that we do face. And I certainly applaud Secretary of Defense Gates's call to achieve a balanced defense capability, even as I acknowledge that achieving balance is extremely challenging. It requires us to balance the certainty that American soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines are in combat today and will be in combat tomorrow, against the possibility of other contingencies, including great power conflict, contingencies that may be of lower probability than the certainty of today's combat, but would have extremely high consequence. And finally, I think we need to acknowledge that readiness involves not only preparing for and fighting today's wars, but also reassuring our allies and deterring aggressors in order to prevent war. And back to Tom Donnelly's comments, I think these are some of the criteria we should use to assess our readiness. Certainly the strategic environment that we face today further complicates the task. We face challenges all the way from non-state terrorist organizations such as al-Qaeda and its associated movements, up to regional rogues such as Iran and North Korea, up to China's military modernization. Let me focus on one of those challenges, I think a particularly stressing challenge, that posed by China's development of anti-access capabilities. As Rudy mentioned, the QDR independent panel identified a number of challenges that we face. We also identified a number of shortfalls in U.S. force structure. I want to focus on Chinese anti-access capabilities. This is a matter of some urgency, since China is, for the first time, close to achieving a military capability to deny the U.S. and allied forces access to much of the Western Pacific Rim. China's military modernization calls into question a number of assumptions upon which the United States has based its defense planning since World War II. Specifically, the assumption that the United States will enjoy an operational sanctuary in space is now in question due to China's development of anti-satellite and other capabilities that are adequately documented in a series of DoD reports to Congress on Chinese military power over the years. Second, the assumption that U.S. bases in Guam and Japan and elsewhere will be secure from attack is also increasingly open to question due to China's development of ballistic and cruise missile systems and other capabilities. Third, the assumption that U.S. naval surface vessels can operate with impunity in all parts of the Western Pacific, also open to question due to the development of a range of capabilities on the part of China. And then finally, the assumption that in a crisis, U.S. information networks will remain secure, also open to question given China's cyber capabilities. These developments have profound implications for U.S. national security. We have, since the end of World War II, based our defense strategy on the combination of forward-based forces to deter adversaries and reassure our friends, and the projection of power from those bases and the continental United States to defeat foes in wartime. The spread of anti-access capabilities calls that formula into question. Well, in response to these developments, the QDR independent panel argued that U.S. force structure needs to be increased in a number of areas to counter anti-access challenges. Specifically, the panel called for an expansion of the U.S. surface fleet, the acquisition of additional attack submarines, replacement for the Ohio-class cruise missile submarines, an increase in our bomber force, and an expansion of our long-range precision strike capabilities. Those were among the recommendations of the panel. With the time I have left, let me just outline very briefly some opportunities in addition to the panel's recommendations. Because I think the United States has opportunities to work with our allies and our friends to ensure security in the Asia-Pacific region. First is our opportunities that would come from developing a coalition intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance network in the Western Pacific to help reassure our allies and friends and generate collective responses to crisis and aggression. The second is the need to harden and diversify our network of bases in the Pacific. I believe we need to harden our facilities on Guam. We need to harden our facilities at Kadena in Japan. And we also need to be looking at a much broader and more diverse set of bases in the region. Third and finally, I think we need to look for ways to bolster our submarine force and to work to link together our submarine force with those of our allies and our friends in the region. Undersea warfare is a comparative advantage for the United States and for many of our allies, and one that's likely to be of increasing relevance in the future. And we need to think about creative ways that we can work with our allies to bolster our undersea capabilities. In closing, I'd like to go back to something that Mr. DeLeon said about the deficit and about spending. None of the moves that I've outlined in my remarks would be free, but some of them could be undertaken with modest cost. And I believe that we need to think about the cost of recapitalizing our military. But in doing so, we also need to consider the price for not recapitalizing. And in the long run, that cost is likely to be much greater. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you all, and I'm going to defer most of my questions until the end so we can let other members ask questions. But I just wanted to get us started with, we have the QDR, which is our major defense laydown and strategy. And of course, Congress, I think, very wisely set up the independent bipartisan panel to look at that QDR and say, are we on the right track or the wrong track? There are three statements that came out of that panel that I'd like to just read for you and ask your comments on. I want to start at the end where you said this statement. It said, the panel's assessment is that the budget process and current operational requirements driven by the staff process and service priorities most likely shape the QDR far more than the QDR will now shape processes and drive future budgets and program agendas. I want to overlay that on one that got my attention right off the bat when you said the aging of the inventories and equipment used by the services, the decline in the size of the Navy, escalating personnel entitlements, overhead and procurement costs, and the growing stress on the force means that a train wreck is coming in the areas of personnel, acquisition, and force structure. I'd like your comments on those two statements, if you would, and compare that. Yesterday, the Secretary of the Navy was here, and I asked him about that statement, and he said that the only difference between the numbers the Navy has for ships and the number the panel had for ships was the way they counted the ships, and there really wasn't any difference. Can you just give me your thoughts on those statements?
Well, yes. One, on the QDR process itself, I think the members of the Commission felt that there were times where there had been dramatic strategic reviews. Reagan administration in 1981, the base force of Secretary of Defense Cheney and General Powell in 1991, the bottom-up review in 1993, and then in the other times, the QDR process had been process-driven more than strategically driven. So I think one of the points was
that the QDR may come too early in a new administration. When we go through a transition from one administration to the next, the legal requirement is for the QDR to come in year one. The challenge of staffing up a new administration in the key Pentagon jobs and the speed with which the other body occasionally acts on the confirmation process means too many things just happen in that first year. So validating when the QDR needs to occur, it needs to be strategic. So that's point one. I think point two, we were concerned that in terms of the number of ships, we chose our words very carefully. Steve Hadley, the former National Security Advisor, and I wrote that section, access to all of the international areas of the Pacific. And so that's a presence issue. It's probably maritime because those are highly effective mobile platforms. And so, I think what we were emphasizing was you need to make sure you have the force structure for the Pacific, and you need to make sure that you have the strategy for the Pacific. We did not get into a bean counting on the number of ships. Our concern was that, again, that the cost of the ships may be as much a constraint as the budget that's available for the ships, but that clearly, if we were trying to prioritize, we would say the Pacific is the area where you have to prioritize.
Mr. Donnelly?
To take the questions in reverse order, I would stand by the panel's ship number, which was thoroughly scrubbed by John Lehman, who knows how to count ships. It's one thing he knows extraordinarily well. I think this has been a Pentagon talking point and critique of the panel report since it was released, and I think as a matter of analysis, we were right and they weren't. But to walk through all the details would be mind-numbing. I want to emphasize, just also totally agree with Rudy in terms of the panel's analysis of the QDR process. I was on the committee staff when the QDR legislation was written, and in many ways, our model was the Les Aspin bottom-up review that Rudy knows inside and out. And the kind of anomalous point of that was that Mr. Aspin, uniquely when he became Secretary of Defense, had been thinking about these issues, preparing for them, and holding hearings when he was chairman of the full Armed Services Committee. So he came into office with that strategic set of viewpoints that Rudy references. There's a recommendation in the panel report, if I recall rightly, for setting up sort of a senior advisory group that would be available to a new administration to sort of help them get their strategic sea legs as they came into office and prepared to do an appropriate defense review. But I think it was, as Rudy says, kind of a consensus view that the current process was not working, and the absence of genuine strategic understanding and guidance had reduced the process to a budget drill.
Just two quick points. One, that the review process has not been working for a while, so throughout the last decade. And I think, counting ships is, I think your description may have been a bit simplistic, Tom, but so I think there's an area for discussion that the committee needs to probe in terms of how many of the ships in the pipeline are combatants, how many are support ships. But in terms of the critical presence issue, again, it's a reorientation. It is a focus that across the Pacific, that is the new lines of commerce globally. That is where the critical issues are. And so you've got to look where are the resources going. We've also got to ask where are the resources going when our allies in Europe are significantly ratcheting their budgets down. So how much of our responsibility for their security do we continue to maintain? We've got this growing issue of access to the international areas of the Pacific at a time when we still have considerable resources aimed toward Europe, and our European allies are reducing their expenditures.
Ms. Haig.
Yes, I agree, of course, with the findings. What we've seen in the last 10 years largely is a shift in funding and priorities within the department to focus on prevailing and current operations, which is commendable and clearly common sense. The problem is that it's coming at the expense of preparing for the future, and I'd argue that in many ways the future is now. It always seems like it's so far out, and a lot of the challenges that we're seeing come online from the capabilities around the world that friends and foes alike are building presents it now. About, I do want to talk about, just again, back to sort of the snapshot of the armed services. We have the smallest Navy that we've ever had since 1916, and we're asking it to do about 400% more than it's ever done in the past. We have the oldest Air Force in the history of the country since its inception in 1947, all of its variants: fighters, cargos, bombers, tankers, trainers. The Army has skipped 3 generations of modernization, and the last one, which was canceled, the FCS, even though there's a potential replacement hopefully coming online soon, was the only ground vehicle improvement that the Army's had in 60 years. So I don't want to overstate the challenges, but that is the reality, and we can't talk about the world as it is and what's required unless we actually talk about also the state of the military. Now, the QDR independent panel, if I can speak for them, Rudy might jump in, used the rough metric of the bottom-up review as a good assessment of where to sort of a starting point, specifically because that was what we thought, what leaders, policymakers thought was needed at a time when we expected the world to be a much more peaceful place. How could we need anything less than that today is really what the message they were trying to send. And to the CNO's point, which actually the 12 budget came in pretty strong for shipbuilding, and I'm thrilled about that. I think they're understanding that there's a true bipartisan consensus to grow shipbuilding and a genuine need to do that. But analysis across the board, from the CBO to CRS to the Center for Naval Analysis, will find that while our battle force fleet is about high 270s, low 280s in terms of ship numbers, we're really on a glide path to building a 220-ship Navy when you add it up and you project it forward. So, I wouldn't even focus on the 346. I'd focus on what we're buying today and if you carry that out linearly, just what does that get you? We're in danger of a 220-ship Navy. And I'll close with just some thoughts on the process, on the QDR process. The HASC took real leadership in standing up the independent panel. The National Defense Panel was sort of a model for this, which you had done one time in the 1997 QDR process. And I think it's wise to consider making a standing National Defense Panel a permanent entity. It can shift in terms of its membership and all that sort of thing, but one that actually informs the QDR process before the department gets underway, so that you can get out of some of that groupthink.
Dr. Mankin.
I would echo what my colleagues have said about the panel's recommendation of 346 ships versus the programmed or the planned 313. I think it's as Mackenzie said, we did look back to the bottom-up review as a blank sheet look at U.S. requirements for a more peaceful era than we see today. And I think there was a general sense that the current force structure is likely to be insufficient given the challenges that we face. As to the QDR process, I'm in the unique position of having played a minor role in the 2006 QDR, run the office that did a lot of the preparation for the 2010 QDR, and then being on the QDR independent panel. My general observations are 2. First, that the quadrennial defense reviews their success is directly proportional to the amount of time and effort the most senior leadership of the department is willing to commit. And I think that goes back to Mr. DeLeon's point that there have been dramatic changes in our defense strategy, but those have really occurred when President, the Secretary of Defense are directly involved. At other times, things go less well. As to the timing, I'm one of those people that believes that the current timing is probably the least bad option. The QDR used to be submitted earlier, and I think that the experience was that a new administration didn't have all of its folks in place and couldn't really put its stamp on the review. If you wait later, which I think sort of sound analysis would say you want to take longer and so forth. If you wait later, you're really into the administration's second or third budget going up before Congress, and there's very limited ability for the administration to shape things. So I'm not a fan of the process, having been a part of it multiple times. Definitely not a fan of the process. But I think I'd say that the current timing, at least, is sort of the least bad option out there.
Ms. Berdella.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And again, thank you to all the witnesses. Each of your statements were very insightful, and some presented some daunting issues. So I'd like to start with Mr. De Leon first. As you know, U.S. Pacific Command, as well as other commands, has extensive programs in the military to foster military-to-military and military-to-civilian relationships in their respective AORs. You mentioned the Pacific region being a strategic area, and of course, I have to agree with you on that. My question for you is this: with what other countries should the U.S. be expanding our relationships to enhance our partnerships? And also, can you comment on the effectiveness, both geopolitical and budget-wise, of the National Guard State Partnership Program? How do you see this program playing a part in the mixture of tools available to a combatant command?
Thank you. When we look at Asia, our military-to-military relationship with Japan is crucial, and it has become all the more crucial given some of the challenges going on in the South China Sea. Interestingly, we have a unique relationship developing with Vietnam. They are a critical country in the region, and that's one where we'll do it step by step, but that's clearly an area, given their geographic position in Asia. India, the relationship is still developing, but they are a risen power economically. They have their own issues in terms of their relationships with both China and Pakistan, but that's another area of opportunity. And then, at a core minimum, the United States needs to continue to press the PLA for some kind of dialogue. It's much different than the U.S.-Japan military-to-military exchange. But there's got to be enough of an exchange so that both sides have the capacity to talk to each other when there's a crisis. We had one on the Korean Peninsula. The Americans like to talk when things are at the crisis level because it creates stability, it creates understanding. The Chinese don't. And so this is a problem as China continues its economic development and as it continues to develop military capabilities. But we start with those countries where we are in strategic alliance, and that begins with Japan, opening up with India. We have the model to follow, and I think our Army led right after the fall of the breakup of the Soviet Union, and those relationships that they had informally that they were able to solidify with those Warsaw Pact countries that made for their rapid admission into NATO. But that's having those relationships, and you have to start them early. Young officers who become the leaders need to have those relationships when they're young. Finally, there are great roles that the Guard can play, particularly on the humanitarian missions to support the active duty forces, as well as the fact that the National Guard units are now a key strategic reserve. In our tenures, we've seen the Guard go from being sort of a backup contingency for a big war in Europe to being operationally able to deploy quickly. The committee has had a clear voice on this for the last 30 years in terms of Mr. Montgomery and the Guard and the critical role that they play and the contingencies that they bring on the non-traditional areas.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Dr. Mencken, I have a question for you. In your testimony, you mentioned China's fast-growing anti-access capability, which I certainly agree in your statement, and the correlating recommendations from the QDR which call on countering this threat by expanding the U.S. Navy's surface and subsurface fleets. increasing the bomber force, and expanding our long-range precision strike capability. Now, these types of military weapons systems are often used in strategic environments which are very different from those we have our men and women pursuing today in Iraq, Afghanistan, and elsewhere around the world. How would you recommend we continue using our military forces to defeat non-state actors and other threats while training them and equipping them for the future strategic threats that you mentioned? And what do you consider the single most important shift in readiness priorities from the Department that this committee should consider during this year's cycle?
Thank you for that question. On the dealing with non-state actors and dealing with terrorist organizations, I think the most important role that the U.S. Defense Department will be playing and the services will be playing as we move forward is in training and advising foreign militaries. I think in many ways, as we look back, Iraq and Afghanistan will not be the typical way that we'll go about it. I think the typical way we will go about it is the typical way we have gone about it in the past, which is to help governments that are under threat from insurgencies and terrorist groups to build up their capacity to defeat those threats. And certainly, as we've seen in the Philippines, working with the armed forces of the Philippines, strengthening their capacity, I think that's going to be a key role. And while in my remarks I focused a lot on naval and air capabilities for dealing with anti-access challenges, I think for the Army and for the Marine Corps, building the capacity to advise foreign militaries really is going to be key. It's not going to necessarily be the majority of troops involved, but a very key part of the force structure. As Ms. Eaglin mentioned earlier, our special forces, Army Special Forces, are the only part of the U.S. military that are recruited and trained, with an expertise and selected based on their aptitude for dealing with foreign militaries. And I think strengthening that capacity is key. Now, you say single most important thing that the subcommittee can do. I would go back to dealing with China's anti-access capabilities. And again, there are a cluster of capabilities associated with that, and that you outlined. But then also improving our infrastructure and our basing infrastructure, and making sure that our bases in the Asia-Pacific region are hardened and survivable, I think is important. I think it's important for deterrence. I think it's important for reassuring our allies. And should there be a conflict, and I certainly hope there won't be, it would be important then too. But I think the greatest value for these types of investments is in averting conflict. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Doctor. And I do have other questions, Mr. Chairman, if we're going to have a second round. Thank you.
Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'd like to just make a general statement, and then I'd like the committee members to respond as fast as possible. And I believe, and I think most believe, that well-trained, well-equipped soldiers with proper dwell time should be our priority, and they are the key to victory for us in any conflict that we go into. The Department of Defense and the generals in most cases say the same thing, yet when we look at DOD proposals, the DOD has proposed to eliminate the number of soldiers, or to reduce the number of soldiers by 43,000 to hire 30,000 additional bureaucrats or procurement officers. DOD proposes to eliminate the C-17 buy, which is arguably the most important plane in our fleet with everything that we do with it. I can understand reducing the purchase if we have enough, but to totally eliminate it when you've already got the line up and running, to me seems not a very wise thing to do. And they want a new bomber that they tell us they can't get to us before 2025. And if they follow their current track record, it'll be somewhere closer to 2035 or maybe 45 before we get the new bomber. And my question is, there's an obvious disconnect here. And what's wrong at DOD, and how do we fix it?
I do not mean this as a flip answer, but DOD is an institution that's suffering from lack of guidance and not enough money to do all the things that it's being asked to do. I mean, it's a big bureaucracy. You know, they get a lot of money, but their tasks are larger than the force can handle.
Can I
Yeah,
stop you right
sure.
there? Because I want to hear other people. But okay. But they're proposing to eliminate approximately 45,000 soldiers and hire 30,000 bureaucrats. If we talk about their budget, they're going to spend a whole lot more and pay those 30,000 bureaucrats a whole lot more than they're going to pay the soldiers. So from the budget standpoint, they don't seem to care what they spend.
Actually, I believe Secretary Gates has put at least a halt on expanding the civilian workforce. So I'm not quite sure that the original plan to hire additional procurement officers is going to proceed as originally announced by the administration. I share a concern about Army and Marine Corps end strength cuts. We've seen this movie before. We always believe there'll never be another land war, and then there is. So that's something that's deeply worrying to me.
Okay. Would one of the others speak specifically to the decision to absolutely eliminate the C-17 buy and the value of that plane to our fleet, while at the same time pursuing another plane that they can't have to us before 2025?
Go ahead, Mackenzie.
Absolutely. First, let's start with the practical implications of permanently shutting down a line, which you've alluded to here, and the great costs of doing so, not just in the termination fees, but of losing America's only wide-bodied cargo production line in existence.
Absolutely.
So, you know, it's not just a C-17, but, you know, you want the capability for more C-5s or C-130s or any one of these types of platforms that are incredibly, I mean, current operations grind to a halt without the ability to move people and equipment around the globe. We saw when the U.S. military responded to humanitarian operations in Haiti, C-17s, along with the other wide-body cargo aircraft, were diverted from missions in Afghanistan because there just simply aren't enough to do everything, as Tom has said. The benefits of this sort of strategic lift go beyond, you know, warfighting operations, of course, to every other type of mission, to building partner capacity, to the humanitarian assistance, and more. The most interesting part about actually closing this line and then restarting it if we choose to do so, which we usually find out after the fact that these are mistakes. The cost of closing down the line is about $6 billion if you want to restart it later. So to answer your question, what we're seeing in the department are budget-driven strategies, and so you have a short-term cost savings that appears as a cost savings, but it's really going to cost you more money in the long term. Whereas if you have sort of stable, predictable, you know, defense budgets and you're building enough of everything, you actually save money. But what they're saying is, we need this dollar to go here as opposed to here. And it's a short-sighted investment decision that ends up, again, costing you more, because what's not noted publicly by DOD are two things: the cost of termination of any major program. It's very expensive to pay the contractors when you say you're going to build this and then you decide to build fewer than that number. But also the cost of restarting, as I've mentioned. And then what you have are the long-term, nobody talks about the fact that you're going to have to rebuild something again in the future. So, for example, take the Marine Corps Expeditionary Fighting Vehicle. Yes, it saves money if you cancel it this year, but the Marine Corps still needs an amphibious combat vehicle. So we're not really saving any money by not building it this year. We're just pushing that bill to next year or the year after.
May I, sir?
That's up to the chairman. Our time's expired. If he's
I think you're asking a good question, and you ought to ask that of the witnesses as they come. Maybe I'll follow up and come and visit. On the civilian side, as we deployed to combat, we were short the people in the field who can do contracting. And this is logistics contracting. We ended up taking a lot of people out of the Corps of Engineers who would manage, you know, a $50 million or $100 million water projects putting them into Iraq where they were supervising $1 billion a week in logistics contracting. So it turns out that the people who can write contracts are fairly important to the effort. Mackenzie talked about the slow rate of modernizing, particularly Army procurement equipment. One of the things the Army needs to do a little bit better is to frame their requirements so that the government knows exactly what it's buying. I'm not sure that they still have some of the technical expertise to specify what the exact composition of the vehicles are to look like, things like that. And so that's a requirement, that's translating requirements to contracts. And it's hugely important to the warfighter who needs the equipment, and it's hugely important to the taxpayers because they need to pay a fair price for the equipment. So figuring out how to do that better, Mackenzie's right. We're living off of the M1s and the Bradleys, and the legacy of those who put those in the pipelines as long as 30 years ago.
And it's on this issue of shutting down production lines. I mean, I think we need to have a strategic view of these types of decisions. And we should be looking not only at U.S. acquisition, but also foreign acquisition as well. I mean, just to take the C-17 example, I could talk about other examples as well. I mean, we've sold a number of C-17s, and I think there are opportunities to sell more of them. I think in our planning, we should be taking those export opportunities into account to hopefully try to keep these production lines and, as Mackenzie said, the expertise in place to bridge the gap until the next time we use them. And I think that there are all sorts of opportunities to do that in other parts of our production capability as well, to include UAVs, for example, and even maybe our submarine capabilities. I think we need to have that strategic view of our production capacity because we have drawn it down. I think we have drawn it down to a point where you have maybe one or two providers of any particular capability, which is sort of the ragged edge of where you want to be if you want to be competitive.
Thank you. And now recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Reyes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this hearing. I think we're just starting to scratch the surface of the many different issues that affect our readiness. For instance, I'm always I guess, perplexed that 40 years ago when I was in Vietnam, I was dodging the AK-47 and RPGs. Today, those are still a basic staple weapon that our troops are very much concerned about, not just in Iraq, but today in Afghanistan and in different parts of the world. So there are basic, I got to Vietnam when the M16 was an issue, because it was jamming. It wasn't designed to be in the mud and the muck and all that other stuff. And our troops. I wasn't an 11 Bravo. I wasn't a grunt. I was a helicopter crew chief. But we carried them into battle. So we heard all those concerns, and some were openly saying, we got to kill the enemy and get their AK-47 so we can defend ourselves. Now, why I mention that is because sometimes in our effort to modernize, to continue to modernize, we fail to see that sometimes a basic staple. Now, the AK-47 doesn't work for our special ops troops. I mean, they carry weapons that have to be silenced and all of those other things. But a staple of the regular weapons has to be different, which I guess the frustration I feel is that we shouldn't modernize for modernization's sake and to keep these things kind of self-perpetuating themselves. And one of the things that I've learned over the course of being on the Intelligence Committee and chairing that committee is the remarkable relationship today between intelligence and the military, our soldiers and Marines, because of the asymmetrical threats that exist against us. So earlier this week, I asked General Casey, I said, he's retiring, so General Dempsey, if the Senate confirms him, is coming in. What kind of guidance have you received to prepare our Army for future challenges? I'm very concerned about reducing the end strength of the Army and the Marines, because the ones that pay the price are troops and their families. I mean, that's how we got into that. I can remember when I first got to Congress that the philosophy was the two-war strategy, and I think you mentioned that, Mr. Donnelly, in your wrap-up, in your conclusion, which is no longer in vogue, but I would submit we may have to do not just two operational commitments, but multiple operational commitments. And yeah, maybe it's not in the traditional sense in terms of committing thousands of troops, but still, for the troops that you commit, for the special ops that are supported by Intel and vice versa, you still have to have a supply chain. You still have to take care to make sure that you don't send people out there and leave them hanging, because that's not the strategy that we follow. And God knows we've got all these challenges with not just the Horn of Africa, the Iranians and others, but the Chinese. Chinese have been very active. When you mentioned the special ops from whose main duty is Latin America, I couldn't agree with you more. I found it the most ironic to be speaking Spanish on the border between Pakistan and Afghanistan with our special ops people who were telling me, we need to do a better job of paying attention to Latin America. That is our hemisphere. That's where Chavez and all those other actors are busily trying to undermine places like Mexico. A scenario that in the next election, which is next year, remember we just dodged a major bullet with Obregón. We would have had Chavez's military advisors on our southern border, because that's what he had offered Obregón. So I hope we do continue to. This is not something that we do a hearing and move on, and I applaud you for thinking in these terms. But we need to do more. Maybe in a round table would be better, because I get frustrated, and I was a chairman, so I always tried to do what the chairman does and say, I'll ask my questions at the end, so members, because 5 minutes is not enough when you're dealing with the kinds of complex issues that this, in this case, represents. So,
would gentlemen yield?
No, absolutely.
I absolutely agree with you. And one of the things that we proposed was just what you said, sitting in that type of roundtable. Ranking member did not want to do that at this point in time, but yeah, okay. But I hope that we will continue to do that, because I agree with you 100%. These issues are vitally important for us to get at, instead of trying to put our questioning in staccato mode where we really can't reach them. So I hope we can do that.
Well, thank you so much. And can I just make one more observation? Sure. If there's one thing we learned in the two wars, Iraq and Afghanistan, we learned that we shouldn't ignore the first one so we can carry out the second one, number one. Number two is we learned that contracting out is not a way to do that. I mean, I don't know, Mr. Chairman, how you've had input from our troops, but they're very frustrated that some of their former colleagues leave the service and go into contracting and earn 2 or 3 times more than they're earning, because they go with the contractors. We have so many things like that we've got to get our arms around. So again, thank you for doing this, and these are very people with a lot of great insight, and we owe this system for the future more dialogue in terms of, like I said, a roundtable for me would work much better.
And
Thank
if
you.
the gentleman would agree in the committee, the gentleman raises an excellent point. One of the things that we know that we have found is that we had difficulty fighting in both Iraq and Afghanistan at the same time. We moved out of Afghanistan into Iraq. It left us with some vulnerabilities in Afghanistan. And Congressman raises a good point about South America. What kind of vulnerabilities do you think that we are leaving exposed in South America because of our focus on other parts of the world? And maybe you could take just a quick moment to address those before we move to our next question.
So Mexico is the key. The key we owe the government in Mexico our attention as a national security issue. It's much broader than the immigration question. Secretary Clinton was right. We have a drug consumption problem on this side of the border that fuels a lot of lawlessness on the other side of the border because it's a pipeline. On the other hand, in South America, you've got some very vibrant, energetic economies. Brazil is now a G20 member trying to play a global role. That's another area where we have not really focused all that much on our mill-to-mill. But as Brazil, Chile, Argentina become global players in the economy, and then demographically in Central America, we've got the issue of 18 to 22-year-olds, and are there jobs for them, and do they become members of an economy, or do they get into the drug trade? I mean, the drug trade has been an attention point of this committee for 25 years, and it institutionalizes a series of very corrupting behaviors. Some of this is homeland security, but some of it, and the mill-to-mill relationship between the U.S. and Mexico has always been one of a struggle because of the history of the two militaries, but figuring out how to engage that dialogue looking south. Now, as we had an interdiction program in Colombia that had some successes, that had an impact on pushing more of the business into Mexico. Now, as we focus on Mexico, some of the drug trade business gets moved to West Africa, and it creates different plans. But I think working with the government in Mexico as a partner, and then realizing that we've got problems on this side of the border that we've got to deal with, that's a start.
Now, the Chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Missouri, Ms. Hartzler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yesterday, General Casey said that the Army's rotational force model allowed them to hedge against unexpected contingencies. Is this a reasonable assessment of the state of the force?
General Casey has worked hard to build in a rotation force. Since the end of the Cold War, there's been a fundamental impact on our ground forces. Their op tempo has gone up much higher. During the Cold War, we would put our forces forward deployed in Korea, in Germany, and they would live there with their families. The schools were there. You would go to a rotation, and it would be for 2 years, 3 years. When the wall came down and we started to bring our troops home to garrison, we were deploying troops from the continental United States. And so they went from being forward deployed to contingency based. And so that started a lot of wear and tear on the ground forces in particular. And so it has developed over the years a different rotational philosophy. When you put someone forward deployed in Korea, they're there for 2 years. But in a contingency operation, we're deploying the forces regularly. We're sending them for a year, bringing them home, sending someone else. So it means you've got to have troops in the pipeline that can replace the troops in the field, and when the troops in the field come home, we need to restore their quality of life with their families. We need, as Mackenzie said, restore their training opportunities. So General Casey, as one of his marks of his tenure as chief, has really been focused on a larger rotational base. It gets to the earlier question on the size of your ground forces, because not only do you have to have troops for the mission, you have to have the ability to rotate those troops once they deploy.
Can I add a quick footnote to that? I think Rudy is quite correct. However, the effect has been essentially to transform the National Guard from a strategic reserve to an operational reserve, as General Corelli said earlier this week. So the rotational model may be the least bad choice that we have, but the rotation base inside the Army, the brigade combat team system was designed to get people out to make units smaller and lighter. The result is that every time they deploy, they have to be plussed up by as much as 40% with enablers, and National Guard units have to step up onto that rotational conveyor belt at rates that were not anticipated when these force structure decisions were made.
I'm just concerned. Do you think we can rapidly respond to an unplanned event should several of them occur simultaneously?
Well, one, Mackenzie has raised a fundamental issue for us, and that is we have an all-volunteer force. And appropriately, we compensate that all-volunteer force much differently than we did when we had a draft. We've now stretched an all-volunteer force through 10 years of combat. It's been a challenge to maintain the quality. It's more expensive, but no one would want to shortchange the people who are sacrificing so much for our country by serving. But the ground mission is a unique one because it is manpower intensive. And so I think we, as a country, need to ask the fundamental question, if more and more ground contingencies are going to be the norm, I think we hope not, but the troops always need to be prepared, then we need to have a long-term debate about how we raise, the constitutional mandate is to support a Navy and to raise an Army. And so we should probably have a debate on how we raise an Army at some point.
Go ahead.
If I could,
Sure.
on this, I mean, I would broaden this out, and I would say that the Joint Force, all of our capabilities, give us all sorts of opportunities to hedge. And so my direct answer to your question would be, it depends. It depends on the type of contingency that we would face. In some types of contingencies, our naval and air capabilities, which are relatively less stressed than our ground capabilities, would be able to take the fore. Depending on the contingency, our allies would have an important role. If we were talking about a contingency on the Korean Peninsula, for example, the South Korea and the Republic of Korea armed forces would, and particularly their ground forces, would play a major role. So, and this is a topic that OSD and the Joint Staff have to deal with constantly as they're looking at global force management and how to balance these risks on a day-to-day basis.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Kissel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and panel for being here. I'm going to do something I don't normally do. I'm going to talk more than I'm going to ask questions. I generally like to, when we have expertise here, to go straight to questions. But I feel a little bit today, and I think it's the nature, Mr. Chairman, of what you've got set up here today. And I've been writing notes. I finally quit writing notes, and I think it's more an indication of what we're doing here. And the direction that I've decided I really would like to ask in goes back a little bit to what Mr. Scott was talking about, Mr. Reyes was talking about. It doesn't bother me as much that we're going to be hiring some people in the Pentagon if they're going to do the job, because we went through two major bills of procurement reforming when the bottom line was we keep coming up with these acquisition plans that don't come in on time, don't come in on budget, don't do what they're supposed to. We don't have oversight of what we want them to do, so we keep adding all the bells and whistles. And all of a sudden, we wonder why the combat littoral ship, the expeditionary force for the Marines, the Army's experiment with the reforming to the combat, futuristic models, whatever they were, on and on. The F-35 is how many years behind? The engine is 4 years behind, on and on and on. And we wonder why we have old equipment, because the new equipment's not coming in. And as Mr. Reyes said, we have contractors who seem sometimes their intent is to maintain their position and not deliver the bang for the buck that the American taxpayers need. So I don't mind if we bring some of that expertise in, also recognizing that a lot of the expertise is retiring. If the people are going to do the job, save the money, and predict what we need and get it done. And that's where a lot of our legislation went. And I think, Mr. Chairman, that's kind of a gist. And I think, Mr. Chairman, you may be the one that has pointed out that we go out and spend billions of dollars buying equipment, and we don't even own the intellectual rights to that equipment. We don't even get the blueprints of that equipment. You know, we tell somebody to go spend billions of dollars, build it, then you get to keep it. Anytime we want something done, we got to come back to you as if you're the original, possessor of that idea. So all that said, I have some concerns in how we go about doing this. But the end result is we've got old equipment, we've got lines not coming in on time, and we are shutting down lines. And I guess I've got finally a question. I believe one of the concerns that I have is that manufacturing has become kind of something a lot of people don't think we need anymore in America. So if we have to ramp up, if we have the need to start rebuilding, where do we stand? What is our base industrial core strength in America in terms of if we had higher than a normal response, how can we respond?
Just two brief responses. First is, I think you raised a number of excellent points on acquisition, and I would just commend to your attention the acquisition chapter of the QDR Independent Panels report. The task force was chaired by retired Air Force General Larry Welch, who I think has a lot of wisdom in those pages as to how to improve the acquisition process. On a manufacturing base, I agree. I share that concern. If you look at the way America has traditionally fought its wars, we've been able to mobilize our industrial base, and we've been able to produce the materiel that we need in wartime. I think that base in a number of areas, whether it's shipbuilding, aircraft, even logistics, and a lot of munitions and expendables, I think is not where it was, and I do think we need to think strategically about that industrial base. I mean, there was a time not too many years ago where we had a shortage of small arms ammunition just because of some problems with a couple of the manufacturing facilities. I mean, and that's relatively simple stuff. We could find ourselves in a situation where we need to replenish, more complex items in the inventory. So I think that's an excellent observation.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I think you've set a good tone for what this committee, subcommittee can be looking at. And one last specific question that red light just went on. Do we need the expeditionary fighting vehicle? If anybody wants to join, I mean, I'm on air, land in this subcommittee, and I'm hearing so much back and forth. Is that something that we need?
My view would be yes. McKenzie earlier said we need a capability that's something like this. The Marines have to get from their amphibious ships ashore somehow. They can't all fly in a V-22. They can't all ride in an LCAC or walk ashore. And once they get ashore, they need mobility and firepower. And the way to get from ship to shore is either you plow through the water, like a AAAV currently does, or you get up on top of the water, like a speedboat, the way the EFE was supposed to do. The idea that we won't need forcible entry capabilities in the future, particularly in a Pacific contingency, again, strikes me as nonsensical. When you're talking about the anti-access question, what's vulnerable really are the ships themselves. So, you can put all these requirements in a blender, and some version is going to come out, and if it's going to do what you want it to do, it's going to look like an EFE. Or you're going to have to sacrifice the speed, the ground mobility, the firepower, the ability to carry a full squad, or you're going to have to come in close to shore to disembark the Marines. Anybody who's been in a AAAV for more than the first briefing you get is puke into your helmet so it doesn't go out the bilge, it doesn't clog the bilge away. So you can pay us now or you can pay us later.
If I may, quickly, that's correct. So it's not about the EFV. You can call it the ACV, the Amphibious Combat Vehicle, but they need something. So the question I would argue for Congress and for the taxpayers, since they funded this, is when you look at how you build a major system like this, it's roughly broken down into design, development, and then production, where you're actually churning them out. Congress has to ask, and all of you in this room in particular, do we finish that last marginal production at this point, because it's been under development for over a decade and we've spent, I don't have the exact number, I think over $10 billion so far? Or do you make that a sunk cost and you restart the ACV? The government should be leveraging the taxpayer investment in the development up to this point, I would argue. So even if you don't need the EFE and you want to call it ACVX, the point is to keep all of the investment in hand so you don't throw overboard the taxpayer money spent to date.
Good. Thank you, Larry. Now, Mr. Gibson from New York.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman, and I thank the panelists here today. Appreciate your experience and your scholarship. I also note Ms. Egelin's previous experience for the good people of New York 20 I now represent, and I appreciate your service there. You know, I'd like to pick up on a point Mr. Donnelly mentioned earlier about lacking guidance and the mismatch between requirements and resources, which I concur with that assessment. And, of course, just the central question for today's hearing, are we ready? Of course, begs the question, ready for what? Now, you know, from an a priori statement, I don't believe that we can afford to start a war we don't finish and we don't win. We have to do that. I've supported the surges. I fought in the surge in Iraq. And clearly, I think it's a consensus. We're going to protect this cherished way of life, and we're going to make sure that we resource us to do just that. A variety of opinions as to exactly what that means. And looking towards 2015 and beyond, and the kind of force posture, the structure, and how we're going to lay down forces and command and control, I really come at this from the standpoint that we're asking too much of our military. And I want to go to the point earlier made as far as the potential groupthink of the QDR and the role the independent panel can play. And I'm curious to know, are there divergent viewpoints as to, and any arguments that resonated, that we should take a look at how we array our armed forces, both in terms of posture, command and control, the requirements thereof, discussions that came in the QDR and the independent panel, and your assessment as to whether or not you think we have a system that allows for alternative viewpoints.
Well, Mr. Gibson, I think first the alternative viewpoint in our process comes from the Congress. And so that is the institutional role. The President is the Commander-in-Chief. Most of us have taught courses on this. The President is the Commander-in-Chief, and the Congress provides for the common defense in terms of the raising of the Army and supporting a Navy and the rules and regulations thereof. So this is the unique relationship that every administration and every chairman of the committee and chair of the subcommittee have to deal with and come to grips. And so it is, and it is, we've spent a morning talking about the requirements. You know, we're sitting on this side of the table and we're no longer responsible for the resource generation. When we served in our various offices, we had to have that balance, and that's where I think the challenge and the debate comes. Looking at each of these situations, the Pacific, the troops in Iraq and Afghanistan, you know, I've always felt that when you have fighting troops in the field, they become the #1 priority. I think Secretary Gates told the QDR panel one of his issues in the Pentagon was that the Pentagon was too quick to get into the next budget instead of focusing on the troops in the field and what are their requirements. And once, you're correct, once we start, your moral obligation is to the troops in the field. We probably need a better, more detailed process at the front end when we decide to deploy the troops. With an all-volunteer force and supplemental appropriations, it's very easy to do. If you look back at FDR on the Lend-Lease, these were votes that went one way or the other. On Desert Storm, it was a very close vote, not in the House, but in the Senate, and lots of questions back in 1991 about the first ground combat the country was considering, and so it was good in terms of what were we asking the force to do, what would we think victory looked like, things like that. So we probably owe a front-end process, because when Iraq and Afghanistan have been a bit unique, because we really have funded those through emergency supplementals. That's been a departure in our history in terms of how we have provided for the common defense. And then with a volunteer force, these are folks that are well-trained, ready to go, highly professional, and whether intended or not, the Guard has stepped in and really made an enormous contribution to the country. So I think it's easier to define the requirements and look to the future than it is to engage in that discussion on how many resources are we now prepared to provide. In terms of actual dollars spent, we've gone through a decade where we've spent more than we spent during the Reagan 1980s. Now, in terms of the economic measure of that, it was 7% GDP in the 1980s. It's 4.5% in this decade. So the economy has historically grown and is larger. But I think deciding on the resources, deciding on what the priorities are and how you balance. One of the points that Tom Macon in our staff on force structure wrote is that we constantly add to the missions of the force, but we really don't increase the size of the force. We increase the budget, but we've wrapped around a lot more contracting around the active duty men and women than we had, for example, during as recently as Desert Storm. So that is, I think, that issue of the balance between requirements and resources. Your subcommittee is at the heart of that in deciding what's right and what's appropriate.
I'll try to be brief. There was certainly a lot of spirited discussion amongst the panelists. At the same time, I'm struck about how at the end of the day, most of those got worked out. So, people from a wide variety of backgrounds very much came together on a core set of conclusions. And there was a lot of discussion about what's an appropriate military mission and what should be the job of other agencies. I'm not sure that we fully answered that, but we certainly did talk about it a lot. I would just conclude by saying it's been more than 20 years since the Berlin Wall fell, and we haven't gotten to those questions that Rudy described. They've been out there, but we've been looking through the wrong end of the telescope, if you will. We've been having arguments about how many tanks and how many ships without really thoroughly addressing this question of what is it that we really need to be doing. And that was, again, I think the panel felt that was more than we could really, at the time, or the resources to address. And I would really commend this idea of a panel of wise men or whatever that could be both a resource for the executive and the legislative branch. It would just be a focus for discussion of these issues, because it's a garbage in, garbage out process. If you can't define what the yardstick would be, any measurement of readiness is as good as the other.
Chairman, if I could just have 30 seconds to wrap that up.
Sure, go ahead, Chris.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the commentary here, the testimony. To me, I think these a priori questions, now is the time to be asking. It's really overtime to be asking it. But as we look towards the backside of Iraq and Afghanistan, we should ask some fundamental questions. Who are we as a people? I think we'd agree we're a republic. But when you look at the facts, we look like an empire. We're laid down all over the world. We have command and control that reaches all over the world. I'm not convinced we're any safer by doing it that way. There's something that strikes me as wrong, that when there's an event overseas, the #1 seat of protocol goes to the combatant commander rather than the ambassador. I think we should take a look about the way that we array our forces and how we look at a whole government approach. We're talking about protecting our cherished way of life here, but I think there are alternative visions and approaches that I'm not convinced have been fully developed and at least compared and contrast. So thank you very much for your testimony. I look forward to working with you as we go forward.
Thank you, Chris. And we just have a couple of questions left. Thank you so much for your patience. I'm sorry, Madeline.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I do have a couple of questions, but I will enter them into the record, and hopefully the witnesses will be able to answer them. And also on the subject of the roundtable discussions, I've thought about that, and I think it's a good idea. So I look forward to that. Good. And Mr. Regis also mentioned to me that he thought off-site visits would be very valuable.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Madeline. And if I could just close with two questions, and I know some of our members may need to leave, but I deferred these. We are constantly trying to get the balance between whether or not the budget is driving our defense strategy or our defense strategy is driving our budget. We've yet to have anyone from the Department of Defense to acknowledge that the budget is driving the strategy as we might appreciate. There seem to me to be three components that we are always talking about, but we blend them quite a bit. One of them is something that Mr. Gibson was raising. What is our strategy? Are we asking the right questions for the strategies that we need? The second one is what we saw with the helicopters we had up at the beginning of this hearing, which is, are we making the right assessment of our ability to meet that strategy? But the third one is the assessment of what part of the strategy can we afford to implement. We are always concerned here that we are not getting those three in balance. How do we ferret out and make sure we are really hearing the strategy and not somebody's filtering of the strategy through the budget? Do you have any suggestions, any wisdom for us as we move down that road of how we make sure that we're dividing those three so that we're getting this right?
Well, I would just go back to the readiness reports that the committee did back that Rudy referred to earlier. You have to begin, obviously, the point of departure is the information that you get the department, but it's important to sort of go beyond that and ask, well, are these the right measurements? And I think one of the things we found was that particularly looking outside of the spotlight in terms of looking at units that were not immediately deployed. You know, if you look in sort of the units that are in the trough of unreadiness, that's where you kind of get a better assessment of the problems that beset the force in terms of manpower fill or equipment readiness, or in the National Guard, for example. But to go to the question of affordability, I keep using Rudy as a point of reference, but I think he was quite right. In the absolute, or as a slice of our national wealth, our military commitments are at a pretty historic low, or at least a post World War II low. But the nature of the government and what the government spends its money on, the nature of our society has changed. So probably the largest contributor to our long-term strategic readiness is whether we can get the government's fiscal house in order, I would say.
Yes, Mr. Donnell.
In the mid-'80s, this committee was instrumental in passing the Goldwater-Nichols Act. One of the things, back to that setting of priorities and how to match the budget with the strategy, and most importantly, the strategy with a budget, you now have two very independent sources of information. You have the commanders from the field. You have General Mattis and Admiral Olson this afternoon upstairs in the full committee. So they're in the field, and they are at the front of the spear. And so their mission is, are we ready to execute the missions that the command authority has asked them to do today? You have another group, the Joint Chiefs, and under Goldwater-Nichols and the Title X, their job is to organize, train, and equip, and to not only today, but to be thinking about where we will be in 2015 and 2020 and 2025.
And then you've got the committee, which I think needs to ask the questions of where do we see the country, because we're still operating in terms of the sizing of the military under many of the assumptions that are still derivative of the Cold War, and yet we're in an economic period where the economic power is much less concentrated. My colleague and I, who's with me today, we were in a conference and we were in Beijing a year ago. And the thing about the economists on the Chinese side is that they not only have been trained in the United States, but they're tenured professors of economy at Stanford and Princeton and Johns Hopkins, so they know what they're talking about. But their point was, during the Cold War, we wanted to be on your side. You know, there were only two choices, and your side was the side that the whole world wanted to be on. And now the economic drivers are much more diffused. You've got in the Middle East that's dominated by 18 to 22-year-old young men who don't have jobs. You've got in Asia, which is focused on manufacturing excellence and how you continue to grow economic capability and economic influence. Europe, which is sort of status quo, and then America, which has been the great leader of the global coalition. But the broader issues that I think, it's changed much since Presidents Truman and Eisenhower through President Reagan dealt with a set of issues. The presidents since then are dealing with a much different kind of threat, a much different kind of world, but yet still people look to the United States on the national security side for the leadership. And so I think that's your challenge.
Sir, verbally, you're right. The Department isn't going to acknowledge or admit the reality that most of their decisions are budget-driven, but practically, we all know that that's true. And how do we know that? Well, they've told you indirectly. So if you go back through the hearing transcripts for just the last 3 years, because the 2010 budget was really the pivotal year where we restructured the investment portfolio of the Secretary did for the armed services, and proposed killing over 50 major programs that have been on the books for 2 decades. And when you go back in the posture hearings therein on everything from combat search and rescue helicopters for the Air Force to the F-22, also for the Air Force, to even just recently the EFV, all of them said, I need this and I want this, we can't afford it. What they're telling you is, it's just a budget. That's exactly what they're saying. It's purely budget driven. Now, practically, the tools that you have available to you are not, archaic. They're still very valuable, and I would just take you back. I'd applaud you for your conversation with the 3 stars, as we're calling it, bringing over those less than the sort of the same old faces. The dialogue on that sort of upper middle management is important to get outside of this groupthink. Field hearings, I found, are very instrumental in the work that you do to get outside of Washington, of course, CODELs as well. Senator Dole's former MLA just recently put an op-ed out in the Times and the Washington Times, and basically it had said, she'd asked the current chairman of the Joint Chiefs, how are you going to do everything, to Mr. Gibson's question, with the money that you're getting and what we're asking you to do, and it's too short. And he said in this one-on-one, how do I give you an honest answer without losing my job? But now, of course, that's in the public domain. But my point is that they will tell you, perhaps in just various venues. And then lastly, I would applaud the full committee chairman, Mr. McKeon, for continuing the tradition of asking for the military's unfunded requirements lists. The challenge is that the Secretary has upended that process by requiring OSD vet those lists. And I would encourage you to push back, because obviously they are night and day in terms of what they look like now. Yes, nobody's going to ever say you have the whole world at your feet and you can buy anything you want, but they were an instructive benchmark of what the service thought they needed to accomplish everything. It doesn't mean that you were going to give them that, but those are very valuable tools before 2010 until the Secretary took them over, in highlighting to Congress some of the things that they need to buy and are unable to do so.
Mr. Chairman, I think this committee offers an important independent venue for assessing risk, and I think really what we've been talking about throughout this session, really in different ways, is risk and ways that you balance risk. I mean, in the old days, we used to be able to throw money at it and buy down risk. We can do that to some extent, but I think we're much more in a situation where we need to accept some forms of risk, but we need to be cognizant that we're doing so. And I think what my colleagues have been saying is it can be difficult to get a straight answer as to what the real risks are. And so I think groups like the QDR independent panel, like things like this hearing, are a great venue to get other voices and other assessments of risk that can then help you make the decisions as to how we deal with that risk.
Thank you. Ms. Bordello has, I think, a follow-up question. Oh, you're done? If not, then I just want to thank all of you for the service you've done to your country in so many different venues, coming in here, the great work you did on that panel, and thank you for spending this morning with us and help bring us up to speed. And we look forward to picking your brains down the road as we go. So thank you all very much, and we're adjourned.